Hi, ActiveHistory.ca presents a recording of historian Ian McKay's talk, The Empire Strikes Back, Militarism, Imperial Nostalgia, and the Right-Wing Reconceptualization of Canada. McKay's talk was the keynote address of the 15th Annual New Frontiers Graduate History Conference at York University. Please check back on ActiveHistory.ca in the near future for more podcasts on important historical issues.
My talk today is in three parts, and what I really want us to focus on is the extraordinary sea change that is occurring all around us in Canadian politics. I want you to reflect on when did you first have your oh my gosh moment. Is this really happening in Canada? What is happening in this brave new 21st century Canada? What was the first moment in which you said, aha, I've got it? When it finally sank in that we were in the midst of a political sea change, a radical right cultural transformation of Canada. Many of you might think back to Toronto's G20 summer, when thousands of people were effectively stripped of their rights by thousands of armed police roaming the streets of your city. Others might think of the Guantanamo interrogation of Omar Khadr by Canadian intelligence agents, as documented in the recent documentary, You Don't Like the Truth. It's unforgettable confirmation of the claim that since 2006, and I quote from the eloquent manifesto of the group Voices, the government of Canada has systematically undermined democratic institutions and practices and has eroded the protection of free speech and other fundamental human rights. For Erna Paris, writing recently in Walrus magazine, the moment came with the Richard Colvin affair, in which right-wing politicians and right-wing media collaborated in attacking a public servant for daring to raise the issue of prisoner abuse in Afghanistan. She writes, I believe the Richard Colvin affair finally concentrated my attention on one outstanding reason: the breaches of international law, the partisan conduct of the federal public service, and the unconscionable smearing of Colvin's name were not ruinous to the Harper Conservatives. For columnist Jeffrey Simpson, writing this week, his moment of insight arrived when he pondered the deeper logic of the government's so-called war on crime and its utopian vision of a country dotted with mega-prisons. It then became clear to him that this is a regime heavily invested in creating a climate of fear on the streets of our cities, in a prison cell in Guantanamo, in the Afghan prisoner abuse scandal, and the hyperbolic war on crime. We seem to be witnessing the working out of a coherent and a considered political strategy for the authoritarian transformation of Canada. So, for me, the aha moments started to arrive in bunches after my friend Jamie Swift talked me into co-writing a book with him about peacekeeping, which we're tentatively calling Warrior Nation. At first, I must admit, I placed Jamie's book about peacekeeping, the whole idea of this book, in that mental file headed worthy but dull. But now I'd rename that same file urgent and overwhelming. The theme of our book is the growing marginalization of peacekeeping as a Canadian ideal and its replacement by a very different, very aggressive warrior ethos. One of my key "is this really happening" moments came on the 22nd of October 2010 when I read the Globe and Mail front page editorial I've circulated among you tonight. Under the headline, Using Our Military Muscle, Canada's national newspaper asks, after Afghanistan, what next for our military? It concedes that many Canadians want to pull back since the mission has, quote, not gone as we had hoped. But there can be no retreat, it proclaims, to a romantic Pearsonian ideal. Battles of the future will be waged in failed states, the Globe declares, and by terrorists inspired by twisted belief systems. Blue helmets deter neither. In any future the Globe can describe, the peace must be made, not kept. And Canada cannot shy away from bloody conflict zones. So instead of indulging in, quote, Pearsonian romanticism, we must advance, heavily armed, into the post-Pearsonian future, a future of permanent war, in which a now combat-tested Canadian military can choose our battles over the whole planet. What I think we see in this editorial, what we see day after day in the daily media, and in the world all around us, is a massive, multifaceted, and ominous campaign to change the very definition of Canada. A revolution has been announced. A war is declared. And it is not a war on the enemies the Globe editorial imagines to be in our future. After all, as the Globe candidly admits in this editorial, it doesn't even know who or what these enemies might be. It can only describe them in very general terms. No, the Globe and others are declaring a war on the country previously known as the Peaceable Kingdom, now henceforth to be thought of as the Warrior Nation. It was when I read this editorial last year that I really got, with the subtlety of a kick to the stomach, how urgent it is to analyze, debate, and yes, defeat this project of the Warrior Nation. For much more is at stake in this struggle than Canadian foreign and military policy, important as those spheres are. What is emerging is a new, potent kind of authoritarianism. It's too early to attach a definitive name to this new political order, but it isn't too early to design many of its leading features. A Canada whose every institution is patterned more and more on the market is now characterized by astronomically expanding gaps between the richest and the poorest. Multiracial tolerance seems not to extend to Canadian citizens who happen to be Islamic and illegally trapped in foreign jails. Parliamentary democracy has turned into a pale shadow, when even on questions of war and peace, no parliamentary debate precedes the dispatch of troops. A Canada we thought had undergone a rights revolution in the 1980s has been shown to have no such thing. People today are even unclear about an accused person's right to a fair and open trial. Canadians who once prided themselves on their civil liberties have gone through a G20 summer that shredded them. Many Torontonians must have experienced a feeling of bleak irony this week when they heard Lawrence Cannon solemnly condemn the grave impropriety of any regime that might turn armed violence upon its own people. Where were you last summer, Mr. Cannon? Who are the new warriors and what is their project? Over the past 2 decades, an impressive group of thinkers, the organic intellectuals of a new political order, have come into being in Canada. They function as lobbyists, policy wonks, think tank habitués, op-ed writers, and university professors. Indirectly or directly, at least some of their combined influence stems from the Department of National Defence, the DND, which invests heavily in defence-friendly research. One such contract, for example, commits the Conference of Defence Associations in Canada to produce a yearly quota of pro-defence opinion pieces, letters to the editor, and so on. In this situation, it becomes increasingly difficult to know if the op-ed piece you're reading in today's newspaper or the commentary on this morning's radio broadcast is the free and honest opinion of a Canadian citizen, or if it amounts to a paid announcement from the Department of National Defence. Millions of dollars being pumped into this project of a warrior nation, in a sense to encourage us to think in a brand new, different way about Canada. So the state now plays a newly aggressive role in reconstructing the public sphere to which it purportedly responds. It itself stimulates mass movements that undertake the transformation of the political landscape. The aim is not to preserve an old equilibrium of social forces, as represented, say, in the Keynesian welfare state, but to construct a brand new equilibrium, in large part by mobilizing and permanently organizing from the extreme right the middle and upper classes. To a much greater extent than ever before, the state takes upon itself the permanent mobilization of public opinion. One term for this pattern is Caesarism. i.e. an increasingly authoritarian politics, often centered on a particular leader or set of leaders with a coherent strategy of demolishing the forces of democratic resistance, and also of encouraging many people to see themselves as organically linked to the transcendent values of the new political order, especially as they are epitomized by a revered, almost sacralized leader. In a Caesarist Canada, Parliament looks less and less like a place where debates in the national public sphere are undertaken. It looks more and more like a sideshow to the real workings of the regime. The actual substantive debates take place within the Politburo or the Central Committee, or to use their more conventional Canadian names, the Privy Council Office and the PMO. As Barry Cooper suggests, and here one quotes from one of the warrior nation's most articulate and prolific public intellectuals, Cooper suggests that our regime indicates who rules, but it also more especially indicates what type of human being rules, and is sufficiently admired that he or she has the right to enforce and coerce a specific way of life. The new warriors think that this enforcement and coercion is quite necessary. Indeed, as you'll notice from the Globe editorial, words like must and need occur with insistence in their manifestos, their op-ed pieces. Over and over again, we are told there is no alternative to this extraordinary military buildup in what is essentially a time of peace. For the new warriors, honor, manliness, and pride are all at stake. If necessary, the new values and the new heroes who embody those values must be imposed from above. Democrats in rhetoric, the new warriors are Caesarists by conviction. As David Berkison and Barry Cooper proclaim, the new right's overriding mission is to transform Canada, and I quote exactly, from a nation of, quote, whiners, associated with a, quote, a thoroughly undignified and suffocatingly maternal political order, into a nation of virtuous warriors. The entire post-1940 framework of the Canadian welfare state, that some of us thought marked a modest but hopeful beginning of a more democratic and egalitarian society, these two intellectuals resolved to abolish altogether, without qualification. Such a welfare state, they write, is absurd. It is an example of collectivist housekeeping. The welfare state has created a welfare state of mind. It must go, they proclaim. I am quoting them word for word. In place of welfare dependence, social programs, and peacekeeping, let us institute a society in which, quote, individuals contend for prizes, honor, and recognition of their superiority. Here are the Caesarist convictions the new right hopes to make the new normal in Canada. When you look closely at the warrior nation, you will find historian after historian playing key roles in its articulation and promulgation. I think, frankly, that they are putting their scholarly souls in jeopardy. Rather like the historian and novelist John Buchan, who knowingly wrote histories that were really propaganda during the First World War. And here is his radiant image in his native headdress. Such intellectuals are crossing the lines that separate honest historical research with behind the scenes efforts to win support for an authoritarian Caesarist regime. They have become mobilizers of public opinion. They have become permanent organizers of a new hegemony. They have thrown themselves into a crusade for militarism in which the spoils of history are conspicuously deployed as so many devices to reconstitute the public sphere and change our very perception of the past. Canadian history, in a word, has been conscripted. Notice the trends all around you. Count the yellow ribbons. Read the bellicose support our troops bumper stickers. Attend to the D&D recruiting ads that appear so regularly on television, many of which counsel us to fight against a series of abstract nouns. For example, fight chaos. I think in this context that doesn't seem to mean fighting something as crash-prone as the world financial system. And watch with special alertness the way the regime uses every battle death to tar with callousness and disloyalty anyone critical of its latest military adventure, no matter how patently ill-conceived and unsuccessful that venture may be. Under Caesar's conditions, the state apparatus works incessantly to brand Canada according to the regime's underlying political and ideological perspectives. Then it sells that brand to a public conceived not so much as a rational citizenry, but as a persuadable mass market. Loonies with remembrance poppies, proliferating highways of heroes, a phenomenally ramped up blood and soil cult of Vimy Ridge. Such cultural innovations are not invitations to learn more about a past we might debate as free citizens in the public sphere. No, they function rather as declarations of faith in a certain version of the past that the regime is presenting to us as part of its underlying philosophical and political objectives. Dissent from this program at your peril. I find it revealing that such war fever seems particularly to afflict gentlemen of a certain age with no actual experience of fighting an actual war. Many, perhaps most of those who actually fought in the Second World War, and here I confess I'm thinking of my own father, came away with a much tougher, more realistic, far less romantic idea of what war can accomplish in the modern world. Far more realistic, I would submit, than today's weekend warriors and fervent pundits. Down to the 1990s, even November 11th observances combined remembrance of our heroic dead with calls for no more war. Veterans of the Second World War to consider that military campaigns are in a sense the pith and essence of Canadian history, that we should enthusiastically embrace a warrior ethos and anticipate an endless cycle of armed violence. For these veterans, these would have been clearly preposterous travesties of the cause that they had fought for in Europe and Asia. In these evaluations, this strong preference for peace, they were not romantics, and they were not naive. They were far more rooted in the actual world than those who would commit us to a succession of ill-defined crusades for poorly defined romantic objectives. Many believed in a more democratic and egalitarian Canada that might make a contribution to world peace. And guardedly, some put their faith in the fledgling United Nations. They did so not because they were so-called Pearsonian romantics. I don't even think that Pearson was a Pearsonian romantic. They did so because they had a down-to-earth, realistic understanding of this country's delicate and ambiguous position in a post-1945 Cold War world. Many of them, having fought one form of Caesarism abroad, would be troubled indeed, I think, to witness its emergence in a different but potent form at home. I am especially interested in the role of particular intellectuals in this Caesar's transformation. A zealous cohorts of historians has used the post-9/11 world to right what they consider to be grievous pre-9/11 wrongs. In essence, they are essentially mounting a revanchist struggle against their ideological foes, both within and without the historical profession. And a revanchist is someone who wants to reverse war-induced losses, often through further warfare. Revanchism, in this case, means the militarist historians are attacking not just their professional rivals, but those forces they think their rivals represent. The entire loose-living, soft, pacifist, feminist, romantic, and deluded generation that gave rise to the new social and cultural history they utterly despise. What distinguishes this right-wing historiographical current from any we have seen in Canada since the Great War of 1914-1918 is the extent to which it deploys the propagandistic power of the state to institute a new regime of truth. In 2007, J.L. Granatstein, the doyen of the new warrior historians, brought out Whose War Is It? How Canada Can Survive in the Post-9/11 World. You could call this book Warrior Nation for Dummies. For Granatstein, to be a Canadian is to realize the Canadian past is basically and internally about war. As for the present, it is one in which the very existence of the country confronts grave, even existential threats. Granatstein does not present these ideas as ones that are open to debate. For him, they are absolute certainties. To argue with them is to indulge in public mischief. Over and over in a Granatstein text, one will encounter the phrase, "the simple fact is." And the simple fact is, in the warrior nation, that only fools, knaves, and romantics can miss the dire necessity of massive military investment in a looming war for Western civilization. To think otherwise, to think even a little otherwise, is to confess to ignorance, perhaps to disloyalty. Even people one might have thought to be somewhat au fait with foreign and defense policy, people like Lloyd Axworthy or Bill Graham, are on this reading mere spouters of nonsense, self-deluded proponents of a false view of history, propounders of moralizing views that are just naive foolishness, purveyors of, and I quote, a poison afflicting the body politic. How much dialogue should one really have with a self-deluded public poisoner? For Granatstein, perhaps the poison purveyor's most odious nest can be found in, quote, a deeply pacifist and anti-military Quebec, a province that played such a damaging role in his estimation in preventing Canada from entering the invasion of Iraq besides our American and British allies. Here, he says, was a childish abdication of our true national interests, first and foremost among which is the maintenance of good relations with the United States. How can these perverse patterns be corrected? Well, according to Granatstein, since Canadians are by and large children, out of touch with the real world, they call out for stern parental supervision. A true leader must arise. Granatstein goes so far as to imagine what a true leader will be able to tell Canadians. And I quote, Canada, this true leader will proclaim, Canada has a dominant cultural pattern comprising Judeo-Christian ethics, the progressive spirit of the Enlightenment, and the institutions and values of British political culture. That is the definition to which you must adhere. Such a valiant Caesar would realize that, quote, he is in a war for the soul and survival of the country, end of quote. And all who oppose these ideals, this articulation of the Canadian essence, are outside the Canadian program. There can be no more compromise with effeminate and dithering advocates of soft power. Their time has passed as we enter an age characterized by an epochal clash of world civilizations. Like Granatstein, David Berkison was gravely affronted by new forms of social and cultural history in the 1980s. Unlike Granatstein, he's historically an advocate of breaking up the country. In Deconfederation, he proposed doing so by slicing up the present-day province of Quebec, which in his scenario stood to lose massive territories both north and south of the St. Lawrence River. To be generous to his scenario, his ambitious plan did at least promise to provide lots of future work for Canadian soldiers. And it would supply no end of exciting battles for military historians to dissect in the future. Berkison brings to the neoconservative table a firm conviction in natural selection as a process working in society as well as in nature. Armies exist to fight wars, and the essence of war, he writes, is to kill or be killed. Those who fail to grasp this essential fact, those who are deludedly impressed with peacekeeping, for example, as an occupation of our military, they are really, and by necessity, to be weeded out of the body politic. War is a permanent fact of human nature. Groups that grasp this truth will survive, whereas weaklings and whiners deservedly perish. In fact, it was largely because Canadians as a whole lost sight of these deep Darwinian truths that the Airborne Regiment committed its atrocities in Somalia in 1993, according to Berkeson. Shadain Abukar alone, the Somali teenager tortured and killed by our soldiers, was murdered, says Berkeson, because, and I quote, ultimately, Canada's people, government, military, and specifically its army, have failed to keep real soldiers, combat effectiveness, and traditional military leadership at the centre of Canada's army. Addicted to their new and false image as a uniquely caring and sharing people, I quote Berkeson again. Softened by the permissive welfare state, hamstrung by Quebec-dependent politicians, oblivious to the hard reality that, and I quote, all international relations, including trade, rest on a foundation of military power, preferring to spend money on endless cycles of welfare rather than investing it in the military. And all of these ways, childlike Canadians have avoided the stern necessities of the real world around them. They need to be shaken out of their romantic illusions. And this Caesarist has no doubts about who should do it. Once again, and I quote, the warriors, the real professional soldiers, regain control. And when that happens, the old-fashioned and necessary virtues of honor, integrity, professionalism, dedication to the military as a vocation, and acceptance of the unlimited liability of soldiers, once again, these will form the core values of the Canadian Army. Only then will the Army of Vimy Ridge be redeemed. And as this last phrase suggests, there is so much more at stake for Berkeson than the internal structure of the armed forces. What is at stake here is the whole meaning of Canada, a country, in his estimation, that was founded on Vimy Ridge. The warriors must regain control. Unconvincingly partial as a historical reconstruction of a tragic event in the 1990s, Berkeson's text was emotionally very effective as a manifesto against peacekeeping and for the new warrior nation. Of all the new warriors, Berkeson, often writing in partnership with Barry Cooper, has developed the most ambitious, totalizing narrative of Canadian history. Perhaps, like me, you think that post-1945 Canada got a few things right. Took a few modest steps along the path to a fairer society. Medicare, some security for trade unions, equalization payments for poorer regions, Quebec's quiet revolution, some justice for Native peoples, a less racially defined concept of Canadian citizenship. All ambivalent, partial achievements, one and all. But still, many of us might think modest steps in the right democratic direction. Not so fast, says Berkeson. Each and every one of those steps was one more step on the road to serfdom. Since at least the mid-1950s, the country has been going to hell in a handbasket. We can call this the declensionist theory of Canadian history. For Berkeson, post-1867 Canadian history comes in two varieties. One variety, the good variety, goes down to the mid-1950s. The bad variety, which takes in most everything afterwards, happens after 1955 or so. So in the good period down to the 1950s, Canadians were okay, and I quote, they rolled up their sleeves with an infectious energy and enthusiasm, convinced that they lived in the best country in the whole world. What was their secret? Simple. They realized that, quote, people must do things for themselves and not rely on others or on government for their well-being. They had a sense of destiny and purpose. Competent ministers did their jobs well and balanced the books. The search for meaning and virtue was a private affair for every Canadian. And then the bad things started to happen. The government started to mess up. The welfare state commenced its awful work. People forgot the timeless insight of political theorist Leo Strauss. Compassion, if it is a virtue at all, is an individual, not a political one. Diefenbaker, enamored of a vision of government as the great equalizer, made things even worse. He never understood, Berkeson explains, and I quote, the basic assumption that it is morally wrong and economically unsound for individuals to become dependent upon the state for their personal prosperity. This was a statement that Berkeson proclaimed, of course, from his vantage point at the publicly funded University of Calgary. Of course, with Pearson and Trudeau, things just get worse and worse and worse. What then, for Berkeson, should freedom-loving Canadians do once they absorb the lessons of this decline and fall narrative? Simple, quote, in the first place, in the second place, and in the nth place. This means dismantling the welfare state. It must go. More to the point, we must destroy it with gusto. I'm not making this up. These are all direct quotations from Berkeson. Quote, we ought to be ashamed of it. We ought to think of it as the burden of our own dependency, a shackle on our opportunity, a restriction on our freedom, an insult to our dignity and self-respect. In this Berkesonian version of Tea Party North, peacekeeping is just one more bad romantic idea. It is the projection of, quote, a suffocatingly maternal and intrinsically corrupting welfare state. We are shoving this terrible formula onto the whole world with our naive, unmanly, and impossible idea of peacekeeping. Peacekeeping, then, is not just ill-advised. It originated in, and to a great extent exemplifies, an immoral and unmanly Canada. And a Canada that is increasingly addicted to a kind of moral nihilism. And in using that phrase, I'm incorporating one from another prominent right-wing intellectual you might have heard of, who goes by the name of Stephen Harper. Both Granatstein and Berkeson are mobilizing Canadian history to reshape the Canadian future. The Canada that shimmers in such warriors' fevered imaginations is no effeminate welfare state, but a manly and virtuous nation of warriors. It is based upon the blood and soil of Flanders fields. It is engaged in a perpetual war with the tyranny and chaos created by less evolved barbarians. Only an enlightened elite can rescue this degenerating land from the grip of the do-gooders who have, for the 5 decades after 1945, turned the gold of Confederation into the dross of welfare dependency. We must declare the new warriors, avenge the betrayal of Canada. We must seize the day for a new Canada, sanctified by the blood of Vimy Ridge, ready for active service in whatever wars are necessary for Western civilization, as undertaken by the Anglo-American Alliance, wherein all true Canadians can find their country's true destiny. Okay. Well, enough already. I can hear some of you thinking, maybe there are all these problems with these guys. But after all, Colonel Blimps are Colonel Blimps. Blustery, narrow, and predictable. What real evidence have you got that the new warriors' ideas are making out waves outside the right-wing columns of the Globe and Mail and the military think tanks? Well, tonight I offer you Exhibit B. Discover Canada, the Rights and Responsibilities of Citizenship. The 2009 study guide for prospective Canadians, which I have circulated out among you. Study it. Read it. Internally digest it. I promise you a bumper crop of vintage aha moments. Nothing you or I ever write or say as historians will ever enjoy the influence of this book, Discover Canada, circulating in hundreds of thousands of copies among those who want to become Canadian citizens. Immigrants are required not just to read, but to absorb this document, since mastery of its contents will help determine whether they pass the citizenship test or not. It will be one of the most widely circulated statements about Canada's past ever circulated. It looks innocuous enough, with its colorful tulips and happy paddlers on the cover, and a legion of beaming children within. Actually, though, this is an insidious text, one that is subtly constructed to give credence to the new warrior's declensionist thesis. It is pervaded implicitly and explicitly by their assumption that the country's golden age took place before the leftists and the boomers supposedly wrecked the joint after the 1950s. As you study this remarkable document at home, or read through it now, you will notice that both Canada's past and present are centrally about war. Warriors are the significant Canadians. No one else is really in the running. In the section on Canada's history, of the 30 illustrations, 20 depict plainly military events or figures. By contrast, there is not a soldier to be found in A Look at Canada 2005, this document's predecessor as a guide to citizenship. And the images of war herein, you will notice, are profoundly romantic. These are all cleaned up Victorian images of battle reminiscent of the Boys' Own Annual, with no blood, gore, or bombed out city centres in sight. Going to war looks like a lot of fun. And afterwards, unlike almost all 20th century Canadian politicians, i.e. all the architects of the post-1945 state, you get to be commemorated in an official publication as a Canadian hero. Actually, as you study the book, you will notice that we have a whole new raft of Canadian heroes, a vast new cast. Long before Canada even took shape in 1867, our heroes were somehow already out there in the world, putting down unruly Afghans, troublesome Russians, and misguided apostles of independence for India. Who knew before this guide that Canadians should feel a surge of pride over the siege of Lucknow in 1857? Of course, the new heroes are all Imperial heroes. And the new myth-symbol complex we are expected to embrace is an Anglo-American Imperial myth-symbol complex. We welcome the new heroes. We bid farewell to the old ones. You won't find Lester Pearson, Tommy Douglas, you name it, in this manual. You won't find, in fact, one civilian Canadian Prime Minister given central attention. Johnny MacDonald has an illustration in one margin depicting him with, of course, a very British election poster. There's one footnote to another Canadian Prime Minister. I defy you, though, to find any extensive discussion of mainstream Canadian politics since 1945, or any extensive treatment of a central Canadian political figure at all. So in this war, in this text, the wars essentially shape the entire Canadian 20th century, with minor events like the Great Depression, the coming of the welfare state, even the emergence of Canadian citizenship itself, reduced to margins or even eliminated altogether. The First World War, the guide says, strengthened both national and imperial pride, particularly in English Canada. It is in such warlike moments that we find the essence of Canadian identity and Canadian citizenship. So the message, if you want to make real Canadian history, not the feminist, soft-hearted, labour and social history that somehow invaded the Dominion after the 1960s. If you want to make a real Canadian history, then become a warrior. And if the romantic illustrations and inspiring descriptions of medals and the adventure of war are too subtle for you, the guide further promotes the military with explicit website information for those who want to make this, and I quote, excellent career choice. Now let's be fair and balanced. Canada's peacekeeping tradition is not entirely overlooked in this text. Canadian peacekeeping gets an entire half sentence on page 24. In fact, peacekeeping receives fewer words, revealingly enough, than those devoted to a description of some Canadians' hitherto obscure imperial ambition to have the Dominion take over the British West Indies in the 1920s. That's important. Peacekeeping less so. In Discover Canada, as in the polemics of Berkison and Granatstein, one finds a Canada that means only one way of life, shaped by one ancient British heritage. There's only one crucial defining heritage that is at stake here, and that is the British European heritage which we inherit from our Constitution. This nation can be projected back far into the distant past, far before even nation-states were to be found on the globe. And I quote, "You are becoming part of a great tradition that was built by generations of pioneers before you. For 400 years, settlers and immigrants have contributed to the diversity and richness of our country, which is built on a proud history and a proud identity. Whatever the great tradition concretely entails, and this 4th century formulation, it excludes by definition people who were in northern North America for millennia before the 1600 AD cutoff, i.e. it reserves the great tradition for the history of the white pioneers, colonizers, and settlers. And although it does mention such unseemly aberrations as residential schools and slavery, the guide handles them gingerly through what one might call the fast-forwarding technique. Almost as soon as such troubling moments are acknowledged, we fast-forward to the beneficent state that has got past them. A key trait of New Warrior ideology and the intricate neoconservative philosophy that underpins it is classical resistance to any acknowledgement of change over time. Entirely missing in this New Warrior universe is any conception of Canadian history as a dynamic process involving conflicts, struggles, and movements. When the white settlers wage war on each other in this text, we quickly push the fast-forward button to the tradition of accommodation that guaranteed our shared traditions, identities, and values. Even more radically, we whitewash such enormities as the deportation of the Japanese in the 1940s. Unsuspecting readers may imagine that Discover Canada on page 23 is just flatly reporting the facts on this question. First talking about the Japanese Empire's acts of aggression and mistreatment of prisoners of war, then moving on swiftly to the relocation of Japanese Canadians and the forcible sale of their property. Without explicitly saying so, the bad things that Japan did are then connected to the deportation of the Japanese. Such innocent readers may not realize that these sentences distill and now make official J.L. Granatstein's intensely controversial 1986 interpretation of these events in his book Mutual Hostages. It was an interpretation that was roundly rejected by the professional consensus of the time. Many critics observed that Granatstein had established a false parallel between the actions of a country with which we were at war and the repressive and racist actions of our own state against its own citizens. There is no legitimate parallel, except perhaps the one of race. Now Granatstein has had his sweet revenge on his scholarly critics. A thesis that 2 decades ago was widely rubbished as illogical and unfounded, as well as disturbingly redolent of doctrines of racial essence, is now distinctly implied in a document massively distributed and becoming an official truth by our federal state. Professional revenge, in this case, is a dish that is best served cold. Bon appetit. One last important element to note in this beginner's guide to the warrior nation, aka Discover Canada, is the extraordinary emphasis on the British monarchy and its Canadian representatives. In the 2005 manual, the Queen languished in obscurity, and Canada was simply described as a democracy with a system of parliamentary government. Now the Queen is emphatically the star of the show. More than that, the very definition of Canada has changed. Now no mere democracy as it was in 2005, we are centrally and essentially a constitutional monarchy. Many post-1945, and especially post-1982 Canadians, might have cherished the thought that we were creating a country that had finally slipped from its colonial moorings. Hence, of course, the sense that many of the architects of Canadian foreign policy had in the 1940s and in the 1950s of trying to navigate in highly troubled waters, trying to find a distinctive Canadian voice, and that voice ended up being United Nations peacekeeping, something we could do in this incredibly difficult new world of Canadian independence. But these now seem to be the illusions of our time. For now, Canadians learn that they are deeply and intrinsically, and even by definition, Anglo-American colonials. 3 times are we reminded of the country's core monarchical definition, in a guide that also includes the first verse of the lyrics of the royal anthem, God Save the Queen. Truly, the Empire is fighting back. Of course, this might just reflect the views of the select individuals listed at the back as authorities in Canadian history. Prominent among them, we find recent immigrants from Britain, affiliates of institutes deeply invested in the neoconservative revolution, even avid supporters of the Monarchist League of Canada. Yet it is also striking how completely this document sustains the Berkeson-Granstein declensionist thesis. If you really believe, as neoconservatives believe, that post-1945 Canada has been an unwise experiment in effete moral relativism and social democratic softness, with peacekeeping as their malign international outcome, if you really believe that, then you will do whatever is necessary to solidify the images and ideals that prevailed in Canada before these bleak post-war years. Even the late lamented term Dominion of Canada is resuscitated, and I quote, "A belief in ordered liberty, enterprise, hard work, and fair play has enabled Canadians to build a prosperous society in a rugged environment. So much so that poets and songwriters have hailed Canada as the Great Dominion." Can you think of just one contemporary cultural figure? Can you name just one who would ever describe Canada as the Great Dominion? You have to go back to maybe Sir Charles G.D. Roberts in the 1890s. It's adding to the overwhelmingly Victorian atmosphere of this document. Perhaps the most provocative of the new warriors' choices in this document is the elevation of John Buchan, the first Baron Tweedsmuir, and the country's Governor-General from 1935 to 1940, to the rank of the statesman who provides us with authoritative insight into Canada's cultural fabric. Step back for a moment before this portrait of John Buchan, also on page 11 of the Discover Canada. Step back for a moment and just reflect on the audacity, the sheer audacity of this choice. Notice that Buchan is incredibly the only 20th century Canadian statesman to be given this much attention. He has now become the neocon poster boy for a certain version of multiculturalism. He is the only one whose deep insights into politics and society are given a fully highlighted quotation. In fact, the only 20th century Canadian politician to be mentioned in extenso in this entire production. Remarkably, rather than turning to a Canadian writer or statesman to explain nothing less than who we are, the guide turns to a recently arrived and popular British lord and implicitly treats him as the authority on Canadian multiculturalism. Depicted in native headdress, Buchan instructs immigrant groups that they should retain their individuality. While they cherish their own specific loyalties and traditions, they cherish not less the new loyalty and tradition which springs from their union. It's a very messy bit of prose, not worthy of John Buchan, who was a very polished writer. But to the casual reader, it might seem kind of unobjectionable. It might be read to say, just be your ethnic selves and relax and enjoy Canada, just like our cool headdress-wearing GG. This just might be one casual reading. Yes, might be one casual reading, not an accurate reading. Because let's supply some context. From the 1890s on, the remarkably prodigious Buchan was the author of scores of adventure novels, some of which won huge readerships. The typical Buchan adventure depicts a valiant male hero defending the British Empire against some imagined conspiracy or other, generally launched by its many anarchist, Jewish, Islamic, or dark-skinned enemies. For Buchan, the British Empire was so much more than an exercise in military might and economic exploitation. It was virtually his religion. Buchan was an ardent social imperialist, one of the smartest and most energetic of the idealistic young men who pledged themselves to Lord Milner's vision of an organically unified and cohesive and rational empire. Throughout his entire adult life, Buchan saw his empire as the bearer of enlightenment and order. In many of his novels, most famously Prester John, which depicts a revolt against British rule in South Africa, Buchan's heroes fight for white civility against native chaos, for culture against primitivism, for the empire against its mad, fanatical, superstitious, and irrational others. In Buchan's world, even those African natives who seem like Britons, ostensibly Christian, articulate, and intelligent, are trapped by implacable laws of blood and development from ever becoming the Briton's social equal. In Prester John, we are introduced to the figure of the black Reverend John Laputa, who seems on the surface to be a good Presbyterian, but actually turns out to be an agent of evil. For all his commanding physical presence, his martial bearing, his knowledge of the ancient classics, and his Caesarist ambitions, Laputa can never rise above a predetermined biological level. He can only ever be a half-educated native who, and I quote, can see the first stage of a thing, maybe the second stage of a thing, but no more than that. Among the many racial and ethnic terms one finds in Buchan's novels, some of which cannot be spoken from a public podium today, we might particularly underline savages, an expression which deftly combines Buchan's sense of developmental incapacity with a critique of supposed moral nihilism. Again and again in a Buchan novel, the dauntless hero upholds a belief in ordered liberty, enterprise, hard work, and fair play. Recognize that phrase? I quoted it 2 pages ago as a direct extract from the Citizenship Guide, and it's almost a word-for-word reiteration of a passage from John Buchan, our new guru of Canadianism. Of course, there are predictable rejoinders to these criticisms, routinely produced by Buchan's many fans. Go online and you'll find thousands of them. And the rejoinder is that, of course, you can hardly equate an author with his characters. Unfortunately for such apologists for Buchan, in this case the author expounded his own views on Africa, race, and Britishness in ample non-fictional writings. They are pretty much those conveyed by the narrator in Prester John. Buchan was the man, remember, called in to administer the racially segregated and often highly lethal concentration camps established by the British in South Africa. He had a very strong interest in developing and promoting the racial vision he felt was at the core of the British Imperial enterprise. So as he explains in a book from 1903, and I quote, "Between the most ignorant white man and the black man, there is a fixed, for the present, and impassable gulf, not of color but of mind. The native is often quick of understanding, industrious, curiously logical, but he lives and moves in a mental world incredibly distant from ours. Mentally, he is as crude and naive as a child, with a child's curiosity and ingenuity, and a child's practical inconsequence. Morally, he has none of the traditions of self-discipline and order, which are implicit, though often in degraded form, in white people. With all of his merits," Buchan continues, "the instability of character and intellectual childishness makes him, i.e. the native, politically far more impossible than even the lowest class of Europeans. So even rich, university-educated natives cannot escape their blood. And I quote, for the mind is still there, unaltered, though it may be superficially ornamented. Buchan counsels white forbearance and directed cultural change from above. If we patiently and skillfully bring to bear upon the black man the solvent and formative influences of civilization, one of 2 things must happen. Either the native will prove himself worthy of an equal share of the body politic, or, the experiment having been honestly tried, he will sink back to his old place and gradually go the way of the Red Indian and the Hottentot." So, when we gaze upon the portrait of Buchan, complete with his headdress in the new Citizenship Manual, we should reflect on the subtlety and power of the dispensation it announces. One that is both old, returning us in this case to the racial assumptions and values of the 1930s, and new, announcing a newly reinvigorated imperial form of nationalism. For Buchan, the Red Indian was by definition a member of a doomed and degraded race. For this newly arrived Scottish lord, Canada was in its essence Scotland writ large. I quote directly, Scotland writ large. And to quote again directly from McGill's speech delivered by Buchan almost precisely at the time of this photograph, Canada is by definition a white man's democracy. So when Buchan dons a headdress, he is not repenting of his imperial past as a colonial administrator and racial theorist. He is perpetuating it. And unlike so many other 20th century intellectuals whose racial and ethnic ideals have come under scrutiny by post-colonial critics, Buchan is now being authoritatively marketed to us in a state document circulating in hundreds of thousands of copies as the man with the powerful insight into who we are. This is an audacious, provocative move. We are being called upon to attend to the doctrines of a figure from the 1930s who mixed admiration with some of that decade's most authoritarian political figures with a consistent adherence to the racial scripts he brought to the concentration camps of South Africa. We are being asked to admire a Governor General who worried that Canadians might be tempted by new and dangerous concepts of social equality and state provision. Canadians, Buchan worried, even confronted a cultural menace against which he had to warn a McGill audience in 1936, and that was the dire menace of Negroid music. 1936 is about the time of this photograph. In the ordered liberty of Buchan's empire, as in the ordered liberty of Discover Canada, everybody knows their place in an organically unified, harmonious, and beneficent empire, in which the monarch plays an indispensable role as the embodiment of the greater good. You cannot do without the personal touch in human affairs, Buchan once explained, and is all the more important the lower you go down in the scale of human development. Buchan, as the monarch's representative, thus travelled across Canada to provide those at the lower end of this scale of human development with his parental guidance and with his models of male heroism. And lo and behold, when you turn to the inside front cover of Discover Canada, you will find Buchan's metaphysical concept of the monarch has now received official state sanction. And I quote, "Canada is personified by the sovereign, just as the sovereign is personified by Canada." One can only sympathize with aspiring Canadians, immigrants confronting this profoundly mysterious and certainly deeply neoconservative aperçu, which is somewhat akin, I think, to theological conceptions of the Church as the body of Christ. Are we so shocked confronting this mystery that roughly 30% of people taking the citizenship test based on this manual actually flunk the test? So in short, what appears to be a warm and fuzzy celebration of who we are, when seen in the context of the person who said it and his underlying philosophical and political project, is in fact a declaration of purest social imperialism. The new loyalty of which Buchan speaks is fundamentally a loyalty to the empire. Canada may be the motive power of that closer understanding between the United States and the empire, Buchan declared in 1936. And on this, I believe, the future of the world depends. Buchan here is anticipating, by 70-odd years, the ardent imperial nationalism of our own contemporary new warriors. So neoconservatives seeking a Caesarist hero in history, exemplifying their doctrine of a virtuous new empire, can find in Buchan an eloquent defender of the enduring mission of white English-speaking peoples to carry civilization's burden throughout the entire planet, ministering to those at the lower end of the supposed social scale. During a boat trip in the Canadian North in 1936, Buchan spent hours working on the index to his new book. It was, but of course, a biography of Caesar Augustus. It is extraordinary, Buchan wrote in March 1936, how that great man, the only dictator who ever kept his head, anticipated so many things in the modern world. Indeed, extraordinary and disturbing. The hegemonic project to reconstruct Canada as a warrior nation, one permanently integrated into an Anglo-American imperial order, now features voices appealing to very different demographics. The unwashed masses can groove on the take-no-guff paternal masculine authoritarianism of Rick Hillier and Don Cherry. The elite cognoscenti, and even on pretentious occasions, Globe and Mail editorialists, can savor the arcane elitist political theories of Leo Strauss and Eric Vogelin. And in the middle, we have a figure like Buchan, who can seemingly provide heritage-minded, middlemost Canadians with the sense that an estimable British lord offers a solid insight into contemporary Canadian cultural politics. Many journalists joked about the Jason Kenney-esque absurdities of Discovering Canada when it was released in 2009. Yet some, like Chantal Hébert, more discerningly wrote of the extraordinary cultural revolution this document portends. Since I am convinced with my heart that profoundly authoritarian and dangerous currents are running deep under the surface of Canadian public life, I think Chantal Hébert had the greater insight. I see in this document and throughout the new warriors longing for an imagined golden age of empire, a profound and immediate danger. I see in it a drive to eliminate, along with peacekeeping as a tradition, the very memory of a different democratic Canada with which I identify. To agree once with J. L. Granatstein, this is indeed a battle for Canada's soul. I began tonight's talk with the Globe and Mail's breathtakingly militarist call to arms in an imagined future of permanent war. I then proceeded to track the conceptual foundations of this editorial in the military intellectual complex, and now I have uncovered many of the same impulses in Discover Canada. All three acts of reconnaissance suggest to me a concerted campaign to reconceptualize Canada as a warrior nation. Where were you, future generations might well ask us, when you first realized the radical audacity, the unflinching absolutism of the new rights rebranding of Canada? When, they might inquire, did you first wake up to the stark fact of a new regime entailing a dramatic erosion of democracy and civil liberties? When did you realize it was consolidating its political and cultural power? When did you first notice the extinguishment of the values of equality, peace, and freedom to which post-1945 Canadians dedicated so much of their lives? And what did you do to resist and to reverse this frontal assault on that flawed but precious post-1945 experiment in social democracy that used to be known as Canada?
You've been listening to a recording of Ian McKay's talk, The Empire Strikes Back, Militarism, Imperial Nostalgia, and the Right-Wing Reconceptualization of Canada. Please check back on ActiveHistory.ca in the near future for more podcasts on important historical issues.